To have a little more of a conversation with our speakers from today. And the early bird gets the worm, so we've collected a lot of cards already. And my guess is these will carry us through our time. I'll say at the outset, the most common theme in the questions that we got, I think requires probably half of our discussion time. I can't even count how many people said, oh, I'm sorry, the first thing, PowerPoints will be made available later today. That's not what they said on the card. The most common theme was the focus of the presentations was on race and ethnicity, and there are many other dimensions of inequity. I could list them. Each card has its own. There are obviously some overlaps. And the question that I think we should discuss in some depth, not just sort of one question with one answer, is if we're serious about addressing inequities, if we're serious about the goal of the foundation, how do we have a conversation that brings in the other dimensions of inequity? What similarities, differences are there across inequity based on race or gender identity or sex or geography? A number of people commented that there are many disadvantaged white Americans who can feel turned off by a focus on race. So I just think we ought to get some depth on this topic because it clearly struck a chord with many in the room. And I'm going to toss it out, but I'm sure I'll have some follow-up. But who wants to start with how do we make sure that when we're talking about inequity, we look at the other dimensions in addition to race?
Yeah, okay. So we on?
We are.
Are we? Okay, great. So again, not to harp on the database, but we're able to kind of slice and dice in many different ways. So I think there's two important elements. I think basically the having something objective in order to be able to judge where we are, and then also whether we're proceeding in the right direction or not, really important. The other thing is, though, is that to emphasize, the databases like the APCD or even combinations of it can't completely answer the question. I think that has to be matched basically with what these guys have been saying, which is, you got to have people at the table, man. I mean, basically, the granular experience of what it is like to belong to one of these groups, I think cannot be extracted from claims or almost any other kind of database. So that basically the subjective connected with, what we can gather in databases, I think gives us the best chance in order to be able to have intelligent answers to the questions that the inequities we see pose.
So I'm sensitive to those issues too. I think that there's the issue of disability, which I've gotten quite sensitive to over the years, both myself and family members. There's rural and urban, which I think are pretty significant. Talked a little bit about the how suburbs have changed. There's certainly all sorts of issues with healthcare for LGBTQ folks. So why spend a lot of time on race? Because American racism leads to really stupid public policy. And the fact that we don't have the conversation leads to an over-incarceration crisis. And because another thing that's going on for me right now as I think about this is, if you think about what's going on with the opioid crisis, which is a lot of people moving to that drug of choice who have felt themselves economically dispossessed. I was saying the other day, somebody should write a book about this called When Work Disappears, which is, of course, the book William Julius Wilson wrote about African Americans when there was deindustrialization. The drug of choice was crack cocaine, and how that was dealt with was a massive incarceration program rather than the kinds of treatment and openness to dealing with drug addiction that seems to have been triggered by the opioid crisis because it involves more white people. So I think it's really important to talk about race. And I'm sensitive to the economic issues as well. But again, you just got to figure out where the tough conversations are and where you think you can add.
I'm a humanist first and foremost. I tried to lead with the notions of Amartya Sen's human capabilities. I want to live in a society where everybody has access to be able to define their goals and achieve their goals, and I think we are rich enough to do so. That said, history tells me of the need when we talk about universal policies to be identity conscious in doing so. So I use the term race conscious, gender conscious. We've had movements in American history where we've led to grandiose policy that became very inclusive. Medicare, Medicaid, the GI Bill. We can keep going. We could talk about the New Deal. We could talk about post-World War II policies that literally generated a white asset-based middle class, prior to which one didn't exist. In order to get those policies accomplished, there was a tacit agreement that black individuals would be excluded from its implementation. That wasn't happen chance, that was intentional. So I'm all for a new revolutionary evolution in our human capabilities, our society, so that we're more economically inclusive. And I think that's going to be somewhat of a spiritual transformation in our society. But in so doing, the universal approach, without mentioning various identities, we will end up in the same situation as we were before. I want to point out one last thing, and that is that there is this thing called white privilege, which I mentioned, where there is indeed a benefit, not just from certain policies. There's a relative benefit from others not having access to that policy. If you're competing for a job and one group is twice as likely to not be called back for that job regardless of their education, that is a material benefit associated with having that identity. And it's not just race, it's gender, et cetera. But nonetheless, we need to break down those property rights and lead and have policies that really enable all Americans to have access.
So you can, I've got my lab, so thanks. So I want to keep going on this theme because that was sort of the opening question. I hear the notion of consciousness. In both of your presentations, in different ways, there was, I think, reference to sort of difference in distance, whether it's California, the precursor to the rest of the country in terms of the shifting demographics, or the notions of the ease with which we can discount people the further away they are from us. And when you mentioned policies that perpetuated inequities, Medicare is an interesting example. Medicare is also what desegregated American hospitals. So you couldn't be a qualified hospital in Medicare if you were segregated, and lo and behold, hospitals wanted to be paid by Medicare, and so it is possible to have universal policies that undo that kind of difference. When I talk to people with profound disabilities, when I'd say this is more from a little more distance, when I get a sense of the experiences of people with different sexual identities, I hear from them very much the same language of exclusion, distance, entitlement by those without these circumstances to things that we deny those in other circumstances. So again, I'm trying to figure out not an either or here, because I don't think that's helpful, but how do we expand the conversation in a way that doesn't minimize the history and presence of racial privilege while also bringing others in who might not feel that that's part of the conversation that they want to be in. That's sort of, I'm trying to widen the lens, not suggest that it shouldn't be there.
So a couple of things. One is, those are real. Those are serious. Identities are multifaceted. Identities are not even binary. There are things I can do up here to make me more resembling of the white in-group than the distant black out-group. There are intersectional identities. You saw some of the slides during my presentation that demonstrated that wealth was not only related with race, it was related to gender, and it was related to age as well. So all those things are actual and true. I think the answer is we need a real evolution in our thinking about what we determine as our economic priorities. And again, if we determine as our economic priority one where we enable all people, regardless of birthright, to have access from a policy perspective, then that is where we need to go. From an individual perspective, I hate to say this, racism might be natural. Sexism might be natural. It might be natural for individuals to form groups and structure those groups in a way to privilege their own identities. But that's why we have policy. We are social beings, and we don't have to succumb to our nature sometimes. We can come up with structures and policies for a better outcome. The last thing I'm going to say, though, is even with noting that we have all these identities, progressives, liberals, we need to avoid the trap of, multicultural liberalism, where we get so combobulated with various identities that they lose salience. There are indeed some identities in certain contexts that have more meaning than others. So in our recognition of all the various identities, I caution us to not get to the point where we water down identity with recognition of too many identities so that it becomes not even manageable or understandable.
Like I should just say enough said. I think that hits it. So you're raising a really important set of issues. And I do think that part of this is how do we shift from the sort of old model we've had economically, individual competition, to sort of solidarity economics, right? In a way that lifts people and gives everybody a chance. And I think driving through some of these other issues that you're mentioning is incredibly important. What's key is creating a conversation with tough issues, So, I hope you thought I was funny, but it was intentional because when you're talking about tough issues, you're trying to bring people in a little bit with a little bit of humor to make it possible for people to stay in the conversation. But we really need to, on the one hand, so you raise the issue of disenfranchised whites who feel like they've been dispossessed. There's no Mexican going after a coal miner's job right now. It's just not happening, right? That's a kind of consciousness. Now, I do think that we need to understand the pain that's there. Because one of the things that Trump had great appeal to wasn't just racial, and there's this sense of a lost America, and that's part of what his appeal was. But unlike most candidates, he spoke about jobs. And jobs provide people with meaning at work. And so he was really speaking to some real pain that's out there about a sense of the country disappearing, and also a sense of work and the meaning of that disappearing, and then the disillusion that's kind of seen in some of these communities with the opioid crisis, et cetera. So somehow we need to find a way to speak to that pain, and at the same time say it's not okay to say that the reason you don't have a job in West Virginia is because of an immigrant in Los Angeles. They're not going after your job. Or that we shouldn't be dealing with this over-incarceration. We shouldn't take the same sense of forgiveness that we've developed around the opioid crisis and apply it backwards, de-incarcerate a ton of people, strip away a lot of these drug felonies, and create effective reentry programs, because we punished a whole bunch of people out of fear of crime, you could say, but really out of racism. So I think we need to have those tough conversations.
So, following these two guys, kind of a challenge. So I'm not going to actually expand very much, except that you said something basically in your closing that you said, goals have to be big, but there was a reference to kindness in there. Whatever you term that, kindness, or in, faith terms, grace, I think we tried the other way. I mean, our legislature at this point, basically looks more and more like people who have no kindness and no grace for one another. And And I just don't think, I think you described it well, the war of attrition that we're engaged in at this point does not seem to me empirically to be very productive. That being the case, I think we're going to have to cut each other a little bit of slack and have this conversation in a way which is open and respectful and acknowledge that there have been past harms, and then try to say, well, where do we go from here? I mean, after I looked at your slides, Darrick, I thought, that's the question for me. Where do we go from here? And that's when I asked you about, what policies are actually within that kind of, a race, neutral kind of, how do we approach basically something that you just acknowledged is probably deeply embedded in our primitive brains. The collecting of those individuals that seem like us and that we, feel are us versus other. How do we diminish that sense of other? And I think part of that key probably is kindness and grace, grace in the sense of unmerited blessing. Because, there are a million cases to be made for tit for tat that I'm going to preemptively strike you before you strike me again, and I've just never seen that to be a very productive, personal or productive policy. So that being the case, I think grace and kindness are probably key.
Okay. So I'll come at this from two more angles, and then I promise I'll move to other questions. I will say we have a paper in our August issue, which will be out on Monday, that looks at disparities between Appalachia and the rest of the United States. And I was struck, in addition to the findings, that 1 out of 7 Americans lives in Appalachia. So it's, when we think about disparities, this is not a small population. I want to follow up on the last point and then ask one closing question. A number of people asked this question, and I think it ties into where we just were. Darrick, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but as I heard you, I felt that it would be challenging to create sort of the economic solidarity of the working class between white and non-white as a political move forward because of the roots of the disenfranchisement, economically, asset-based, all the other ways of non-whites that although economically they may be in the same group, the interests are not as fully aligned as you might imagine. That's how I took it. Forgive me if I didn't take it how you intended. But a number of people did ask, and it just came up, how do we have a conversation about inequity with low-income whites who feel that they are suffering? And Manuel, you mentioned in the campaign speaking to people's pain. How do we engage them in a productive, positive conversation that doesn't lead them to blaming the immigrant in Los Angeles?
So, well, that was great. So there's a great group in Kentucky called Kentuckians for the Commonwealth, which actually is led by an older white organizer. They do lots of multiracial organizing. They bring together pretty disadvantaged whites with African Americans facing economic challenges as well. A lot of their stuff is based on creating a common vision for what the Commonwealth of Kentucky should look like. There's a lot of faith in the work that they do, and they're able to kind of have those dialogues. In Ohio, there's something called the Ohio Organizing Collaborative, which has been able to wed together African Americans working on de-incarceration issues and returning citizen issues with whites worried about job loss, etc. There are great examples around the country of people having kind, honest conversations with one another, and there are plenty of examples of people pandering to that pain, right? Trying to take advantage of that pain for political purposes and then creating resentments between groups. So we've got I think the faith-based community is incredibly important here. Another thing which I would say is really important that we haven't talked about is I do think this generational issue that I was talking about is incredibly important. Faith-based organizations do a good job of bringing together older folks with younger folks. One thing some groups I've worked with have gotten really to be big fans of is to take old white people to naturalization ceremonies. Because when you watch immigrants basically decide to become Americans and you realize that becoming an American is supposedly about principles and values and not about race or ethnicity, there's this kind of wake up and kind of a conversion in who they are. So I really think there's some great work going on around the country. There's also, again, some really dangerous pandering that's going on.
So I'm going to say a couple of things. I think Trump, with his jobs discussion, was a con. He talked about jobs in the context of othering. So when he talked about jobs, he talked about it about cannibalizing China's and Chinese people in China. He talked about it while cannibalizing Mexicans in America. So he did it in a way where he still othered. So I think it was a little disingenuous. I'm not saying, I know you recognize that, I'm not, so I think he was strategic in that approach. So I don't want to give him credit for tapping in. I want to give him credit for manipulating and exploiting some anxiety amongst people for his benefit. But he did it in a way that again, I keep emphasizing is real. He codified the property rights and whiteness, and I think we all need to recognize that even if we're going to move beyond, the question around solidarity came up. To some extent, white people will have to give up some of the property rights and whiteness for solidarity. That's the deal, right? I think, or if they're not willing to give that up, then we will continue to have stratification, and perhaps change will come through other mechanisms. But when we talk about arguments of economic solidarity, again, I keep emphasizing the property rights and whiteness because the request is that blacks give up their blackness in the solidarity movement. And I think historically, the results of that have not always played out well for that group. A couple other things I just want to mention before I go past the mic, and that is kindness. I don't think individual kindness is going to save us, but perhaps structural kindness will. So I think we need to be careful and clear on that trying to converse individuals to change their attitudes of how they treat one another, that's not the problem. The problem is structure. So we need an evolution to structural kindness.
The only thing I'll say is that I will be borrowing that term, structural kindness.
Well, cite me. Academics want currency. Cite
No. Darrick, you know the deal. The first time, I'll cite my good friend Darrick Hamilton. The second time, I'll describe the concept without citing you. And then the third time, I'll claim credit for having invented it.
Okay, I'm going to turn us in another direction that I think came up in quite a few of the questions, and I'm going to weave them together as I am wont to do here. And it's now, let's move into the action side of this. There's a policy response, there's a personal response, there's an institutional response, and we come at this, if we're on board with what's being described, with a variety of perspectives on what our capabilities are, what the openness of our communities are to these conversations. Let's start at the personal level. You have a large audience. What should someone here listening today go back to their community, their workplace at the end of this symposium and do differently than they were doing when they arrived?
I would urge you to not think about it as a personal change, but to try to figure out how change takes place. And change takes place through social movements that lift up values and visions. There's actually no shortage of policies. I know Darrick can actually lay down all the policies that will address some of the wealth inequality. I think we know how we can expand health insurance to everyone. We know a lot about, there's research to do, but we know a lot about how to improve medical care. We need the social movements that challenge inequality, that push for a different kind of economy, and that push for a different kind of conversation in communities. So my thing to you would be not to think about it personally, but to think about what kind of movements or groups you can be part of to lobby for change. Because it's not just policies and big decision makers, right? It's whether or not there are activists and regular community members stepping up to kind of create the political pressure to have the right decisions get made. So join a movement.
So I'll add on to that in that I think there is the policy, and I think that there is the individual. I don't have a great faith that if policy doesn't actually represent genuine sentiment among people, that it's actually sustainable. So if in fact you try to institutionalize this stuff, I mean, there's no human rule that's ever been immune from being circumvented by another human. I mean, it's just the way it works, it's the way our brains work. So that's why I think the shift in attitude is so important. And it might sound weak that, basically you have to change mindsets one at a time, but I truly believe if we just say, well, a small group of us got together and figured out that this was unfair, and so this is the way it's going to be from here on out, I think there's a lot of people who will grind their teeth, who will not say that, this is wrong, but they will not support it, and they may actively oppose it. So I do think, as I've looked at the structure of American society over the past couple decades and how it's become more decentralized and all that, the one place I still have remaining faith is in community, where people actually do have to run into one another. And I think it's at that level that the momentum and impetus to have true policy change, genuine policy change that people want, actually arises. I have diminishing faith that it's going to be smart people in some room somewhere that are actually going to design, construct, and convince all the rest of us that it's going to be a good thing for them. I think part of the consequence of individual empowerment as a society is, there's a diminishing and lesser faith in delegated judgment. We don't do that very well anymore. And so that means we better ask everybody who's involved with this particular process before we proceed.
I mean, I'm going to echo what my colleagues just said a little bit and then maybe add a tiny twist. We certainly need a social movement, so I would work towards that. In that social movement, don't be timid, be bold, be patient, maybe try at the local level. If we don't have the ability to do things at the federal government in this moment, maybe we set up demonstrations at the local level and build from the local level. In fact, that's how the previous movement was built, the conservative movement. It started local. I would also say that policy in and of itself is not necessarily the solution. People often have talked about, well, once we have an entitlement as a policy, then it becomes hard to get rid of. Entitlements like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. But AFDC, we know that we dramatically got rid of AFDC in a way that we've changed the name, and that was largely racialized. So I don't even know if that adage that entitlements will always stand the test of time, that they may not. Societies change. So, the last thing I'll just say is be bold. The problems are bold, so the solutions need to be bold.
So I often hear that the solution needs to come up from the community, that it's both the individual buy-in, it's the community-based solutions. But I'm also struck by the fact that our community boundaries are so racialized at this point. And so if we say, community, lift yourself up by your bootstraps, how is that any different from saying to the individual, lift yourself up by your bootstraps?
Yeah, so some of the analyses that looks at geography, I admire it and I think it's useful, but I'm a little unhinged because underneath it all is really we're being euphemistic about race, and that's a concern. Now, part of it is we have the data available in geographical terms, not disaggregated by race. For instance, Chetty can't get at race because he's using IRS tax data. But nonetheless, when we have our slogans that come from, and I love the foundation, Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, underneath it all, it seems like there's race and we're just being euphemistic. So that makes me a little uncomfortable. I'll also say that integration is not necessarily our solution either. Integration into hostility is perhaps even worse. So, when we talk about schools, we talk about school segregation. When we talk about communities, we talk about community segregation. But imagine if we integrate where within those structures we have apartheid-like structures where all the white kids get the high achievement classes and all the black kids get the low achievement classes. Then we just structure apartheid. I think what we really have to think about is an evolution to a frame where everybody has the tools to achieve their self-defined goals. And I know that's rhetoric, but I think we can get there, and that's a spiritual evolution. I know I see the flash thing of 10 minutes. At some point, I do want to at least list the policies, but I won't jump in front of the moderator. Should I do it now?
Do it now. Do it now.
All right. So
I appreciate you asking.
Yeah. And I'm going to try to be quick, and I'm going to list them. And if there's more, there's stuff written about these that you can find in more details. Currently, what we have is income maintenance programs, social isolation, that's basically segregation, military conscription, mass incarceration, policies aimed at reproduction, fertility, and family formation. And then we treat surplus populations, particularly vulnerable ones, with social experimentation. Perhaps the most egregious is the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, but we might even start thinking about less egregious programs like Move into Opportunity as also social experimentation on the poor, which might be not necessarily ideal. In contrast, I think a stratification lens would have policies that are race conscious and universal, like a baby bonds program. If the source of inequality is some young adults have access to seed capital, why don't we endow every child with an account at birth that can be used when they become a young adult towards some asset-enhancing endeavor so that they too can have the opportunity to develop capital for economic security? Why don't we have a federal job guarantee? That sounds bold, but there's lots of productive work that needs to be done. And we can have a 21st century federal job guarantee that thinks about care work as well. Why don't we, as our population ages and we have gender issues where women are primarily designated to do this type of work, well, if we had a federal job guarantee, we can give this work the dignity of a wage as well as the dignity of all the other job benefits, but it would also provide a structure of workers so that women at home would be able to go do other things. And I'll be really quick because I know I got the mic and time's running out. Federalized credit scores. I'll just list them. I won't even go into detail. Postal banking to provide a floor on banking services so everybody doesn't have to turn to predatory lending institutions if they don't have resources. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission should perform audits and be proactive in trying to detect discrimination. Federal subsidies to HBCUs to the tune that was used from the GI Bill to develop non-HBCU institutions. Eliminate tracking altogether in school. Let everybody have access to talented and gifted curriculum. And then stop mass incarceration, and then I'll end with one on health. We should have single-payer health insurance. Nobody should have the stigma of trying to finance something at the point of delivery when their life is at stake.
Any reactions to the policy list?
I mean, there's a couple things I would add to it from my perspective, and a couple things that have come from the conversation. So first, comprehensive immigration reform and programs for immigrant integration, including mass expansion of English classes and mass expansion of adult ed. That is such an important thing for so many people, and it really does provide movement forward. I think that it's incumbent for all of us to get into a broader economic conversation, not just about how things get distributed, but how things get grown. So what kind of industries do we want for the future? A lot of that, I think, is, particularly coming from California, what we're trying to do around climate change and developing some of the industries that can be first mover industries with good jobs, good environmental conditions, and you can leverage that for access points. The third thing I would add, and I'll just say one other thing, is, and it's because Darrick was quick, ending mass incarceration is one thing, but that's a little bit like ending slavery without actually having a strategy afterwards, and I know you would agree with this. So we need to spend so much more money, time, and attention on effective reentry programs so people can actually get back into the labor market, get a toehold, get back into assets, et cetera, because otherwise we're just going to slap our foreheads and go, that's great, we're now de-incarcerating, but we're going to kind of continue to create problems in the communities. Now, on the sort of deal about community and do the solutions come from the community, I'm pretty intrigued with, and Darrick knows this, and it's probably something we disagree a little bit about, with the idea of working at the metropolitan level, because I do feel like at a metropolitan level, you can bring together different communities, face to face, race to race, place to place, about trying to define a common destiny. And I see a lot of really interesting efforts about that. And the idea is, how do you do that and then sort of scale that up to the states and then scale that up to the nation? And Darrick is right about something he said. That was the strategy of conservatives in the United States, which is to start at a local level, at a metropolitan level, scale up to states, and then scale up to the nation. People who want a different vision, a more inclusive vision, have to not be fixated on geography, but to understand geography as a way to scale up movements.
So I'm glad we got back to this point because, to your question, I think maintaining the group identifications we have right now, which were constructed in, patently unfair way, it sounds like, is probably not the solution. Forced integration is also not the solution. I don't know exactly what the mechanism is, but I do think that the yardstick is this. Have we in fact decreased otherness by this action? I mean, and so I like the idea of a major metropolitan area. You have identification. I don't know, it could be Bronco fans. It doesn't matter. The big question is how do you cross the boundaries which are defined and unfortunately by some elements of our society reinforce the sense of otherness. And so that it actually becomes, part of the reason I showed you my mom is that everybody has a mom. Everybody can identify with, well, man, she doesn't look that much different from my mom, and that's the kind of thing, that's the kind of granular identification that we have to promote because that's where empathy arises from, I think. I mean, the sense that, your life is hard too. It's hard in a different way than my life is, but it's hard. Maybe we ought to do this together rather than apart.
So at the risk of bringing us too much back down to earth, I asked about community level, I asked about policy, but again, most of the people here work in some sort of a health sector role, and somewhere between advocacy and community is your job, and what advice to take back to the workplace as distinct from the community and political advocacy would you give to the people assembled here?
I guess it would be arrogant for me to give you advice at the local level, but I am an academic, so I'll be arrogant. I don't know. I rightfully so, a lot of medicine is about basically statistical discrimination. You observe symptoms and you see those symptoms and you try to judge them based on some norms you might have about the distribution of them and make prescriptions. So, I guess I would just offer a little caution when engaging in that. I wouldn't say don't do it. It's part of the job and what's effective, but I would urge a little caution and think about some of the larger structural things that are going on before we make assumptions in application at the ground level when dealing with people, I guess.
So, 3 things. Try to have a conversation with somebody you disagree with. Not a jerk. But one of my favorite expressions is that collaboration should be principled conflict. If you're collaborating with people you already agree with, you're just hanging out with your friends. But if you have people that you have some conflict with, but you share some principle about bettering people's health, and you have some principles about how to act with decency in a conversation, then I think that's an important thing to do. The second bit of advice that I might give is to continually think upstream from where you are. So housing really does make a difference. Environmental conditions really do make a difference. Discrimination in labor markets make a difference. So whatever part you're working on, think at least about upstream and to what extent you can impact some of that. And then the third thing I would say is take a chance on talking about some topics that are uncomfortable, like race or immigration or the distinction between the homegrown and the way your statistics look better because you've got all these people who've moved in from out of state. Try to create an uncomfortable conversation that nonetheless keeps people in the conversation. Those would be three things.
So I'll just echo and summarize Manuel's point by saying, go bowling with somebody you don't like and disagree with. Or do some other activity which requires you to put yourself in awkward physical positions, which will provide comic relief, but also a sense of common humanity. I think that we're a very wealthy nation, and we've been able to build worlds where we don't actually have to run into anybody that we don't agree with anymore. And that is to our detriment. Yes, that's individual freedom, and I will say, probably counter to what some people believe, that hasn't been good for us. The maximization of individual freedom frees us of the opportunity and the responsibility to run into people we don't agree with on a daily basis.
Well, if there's a way to summarize this, it's that there's a lot of work to do, and patience and perseverance and boldness will all be required. I want to end on an optimistic note. I am really struck by the challenge of otherness and the barrier that otherness creates to the endeavor. I lived in California during the Prop 187 era, and yes, California made it through to the other side, and the country will as well. As an employer, I'm struck that people one generation younger than me don't have the sense of otherness around the globe that I grew up with, and then I look at my kids, and they don't have the sense of otherness around race and gender that I grew up with, and so I think there's a lot of the barriers they grow up over time, and new generations figure out ways to get through them, and they will help us with this. So that's my optimistic perspective on the topic. Please join me in thanking our terrific panelists for the morning. We'll send you off to lunch, and I don't have the schedule in front of me, but I know there's enough time for you to relax and start an awkward conversation and eat your lunch and rejoin us for the afternoon session.
I enjoyed